This is a 13-minute video, so these videos are relatively short. This is the long queer history of punk. I've been waiting to watch this video for a while. I've had it on my list for a while. And essentially the reason we want to watch this is that what we just saw was a queer anarcho-communist music video. Queer anarcho-communism co-opted the punk movement. At some point, and I think it was in the early 80s, maybe even the 70s, but I think it was in the early 80s, they merged. And by the 90s, the punk movement was almost entirely queer. And this is where we get the development of this queer anarcho-communist stuff that we're listening to on the Counter-Revolutionary podcast, the Counter-Revolutionary Book Club, because at some point these movements merged, and this is the community, this is the particular subculture that produced all of the crazy things that we're seeing come out of that anarcho-communist literature. So I thought this would be a good video to watch, because I want to learn about what the queer history of punk actually is. When did they co-opt the movement? When did this all happen? So let's see. As a musician, I learned that CBGB's punk was always gay, just not promote. I don't think that's true. CBGB's punk was not always gay. That's not true. That's just provably not true. Now, I'm willing to entertain the fact that, like, that this may have happened in the 70s. I'm willing to entertain that, but I don't buy into the notion that I mean, maybe provide me with evidence. I'll look at the evidence, but, like, no, I don't. No. That's just false. I'm sorry. That's not true. We don't make shit up here. Provide evidence. And I have an understanding of this, and I don't think that's true. Anyway, let's look.
Fanzine JD Center.
No, an ad. Dang. Hang on. Skip.
Entered a giant photocopy of a picture of Sex Pistols bassist Sid Vicious reclining in a bed with manager Nils Stevenson, a dazed and suggestive look in both of their eyes. Emblazoned on the side of the page in all caps was the declaration, "All punks are gay," directly confronting the reader and forcing them to question the two men's presumed heterosexuality. To the normative heterosexual gaze,
well, that doesn't mean it's actually a statement of fact. That means that they had to do with queer anarchism. So that doesn't actually validate your perspective that everyone at CBGB was gay. If you're taking a victory lap on that, your evidentiary standard is very, very, very low. Because I'll tell you, I went to the Punk Rock Museum when I was in Las Vegas, and were there some references to queer? Yeah, there were some, but there weren't a lot. So, based on the Punk Rock Museum, you're wrong.
this declaration might seem jarring, but if you know the real history of punk, it only confirms what most of us already know to be true. Queerness has always been intrinsically linked to the punk movement, both overtly and covertly. As Alexander Doty writes in Making Things Perfectly Queer, queer readings aren't alternative readings or reading too much into things. They result from the recognition and articulation of the complex range of queerness that has been in popular cultural texts and their audiences all along. The word punk has a deep and storied queer lineage. The term punk was documented to first appear in a medieval folk song called Simon the Old Kinge, also called Old Simon the King, which was eventually recorded in 1991 by Matty Pryor and the Carnival Band on a compilation of medieval carols. And in the song, the word punk is used to refer to a sex worker.
So fellows, if you be drunk or frailty, it is a sin no more to keep a punk.
The term was later picked up by Shakespeare, who used the word in Measure for Measure, where Lucio says to the Duke, "My lord, she may be a punk, for many of them are, neither maid, widow, nor wife." The most problematic use of the word punk was in the 1930s, when a slang-obsessed clarinetist named Mez Mesro defined punk as a young man who plays the feminine role in a homosexual relationship. Queer rock and roll pioneer Little Richard has a famous quote that reads, "I went through a lot when I was a boy. They called me sissy, punk, freak." Later in the 60s and early 70s, queer male inmates in San Francisco and New York prisons began to wear the word punk as a badge of honor. Bands like the Stooges.
I really want to make the point here because I understand how people can be confused by this. Being queer is not about being gay or trans. So the video right now is trying to make the claim, and they're making a fair case, that the term punk was used as a reference to like effeminate men to indicate that they were gay. But it's really important that people understand queer as it's understood basically since the 70s has not been about being gay or trans. People who understand it that way are doing a surface level analysis on what's actually being said. So it doesn't actually matter if the term punk was used to refer to like effeminate gay men, because queer is a far left political ideology. And so we need to be really careful about that. Now, that's not to say that most of these people also weren't leftists. I'm betting a lot of these people were actually leftists. So someone can be both an effeminate gay man and queer at the same time, but that doesn't mean that you have to be one to be the other, okay? So I'm sure looking at this photo, we've got men that are playing with gender, that are like doing this gender bending thing. They could also be queer in that they're far leftists, and many of them were probably, but that doesn't mean that it's necessary to be both. Like, you can be one or the other, or you can be both.
The New York Dolls and the Velvet Underground all had members who were formerly incarcerated, as well as members.
Okay, so this is actually a question that I've been getting a lot lately. So Conservative Kitty Lady says, what happens when they become the norm? So this is over on Rumble. They're asking this question. That's why I can't display it on the screen. But it's important that we answer this question. What happens when queer becomes the norm? Because we know that the definition of queer is pushing back against normativity, okay? So what happens when they get their way and they become the norm? The answer to this lies in the definition of normativity. So normativity doesn't just mean what's considered to be normal. What does normativity mean? Pop quiz for the chat. It's not just that it's considered to be normal. If your understanding of normativity is what's currently normal, that is an incorrect understanding of what normativity means. What does normativity mean? Normativity means norms that uphold capitalism. Normativity means norms that uphold the capitalist structure. So if you're saying what happens, the norms and the ideals that uphold capitalism. Normativity is everything that upholds capitalism. So what queer Marxists want is to overthrow capitalism and establish a Marxist utopia. If they get their way and they overthrow capitalism and they establish a Marxist utopia, that does not make the Marxist utopia normative. Because normative is the opposite of the Marxist utopia, because normative are the norms that uphold capitalism. They're the norms that uphold capitalism. The social order that supports capitalism. A queer Marxist utopia, by very definition, cannot be normative. So anyone who's asking the question, what do they happen when what they want becomes the norm, has a fundamental misunderstanding of what it means to be normative, because normative is about upholding capitalism. There will not be normativity in the Marxist utopia because the Marxist utopia will not uphold capitalist norms. That's why we always go back to the definitions. The definitions are all that matters. If you understand the definitions of these terms, then everything they say and do makes sense. If you do not understand the definitions of these terms, then you will be perpetually confused about why they're doing what they're doing.
Who were queer and had connections to queer art scenes, specifically the Velvet Underground and their work with Andy Warhol and superstars like Candy Darling, Holly Woodlawn, and Jackie Curtis. These bands also experimented with gender fluidity and nihilistic camp, which, as Nathan Lai writes in Afropunk, presented a version of rock that was free from the musical pretensions and relentless heteronormativity of the prog generation.
Yo!
The queer roots of the punk movement in New York can be traced back to Jane County, the visibly transgender performance artist and frontwoman of CBGB and Max's Kansas City residence, the Electric Chairs. Jane County and her rebellious, unabashedly queer, irreverent performance style influenced all of the punk movement to come after her, including one of the most important musicians of arguably any generation, which was David Bowie. According to County,
Bowie was androgynous. You know, I do actually have a piece that I wrote on the Substack, which is about the difference between androgyny and non-binary. But that's interesting. That's really interesting that Bowie was inspired by this queer punk person. According to the County, soon after witnessing the gaudy spectacle of Warhol's pork, it was fucking Warhol. Of course it's fucking Warhol. Of Warhol's pork in 1971, Bowie upped the ante of his stage shows, adding makeup and sparkly accoutrements to his queer sensibility, which was already visible on the cross-dressing cover of his album, The Man Who Sold the World in 1971, jeez. And this is in Queer Punk Before Queercore. Can we look that up? Queer Punk Before Queercore?
Soon after witnessing the gaudy spectacle of Warhol's pork in 1971, Bowie upped the ante of his stage shows, adding makeup and sparkly accoutrements to his queer sensibility, which was already visible on the cross-dressing cover of his album The Man Who Sold the World in 1971. Fellow glam rockers the New York Dolls did the same, regularly dressing in drag while singing the songs Trash and Personality Crisis, a shtick that garnered them quick notoriety, including with tastemaker Malcolm McLaren, who, enamored with the Dolls' crappy old lipstick and tardiness, was inspired to bring punk back to the UK, eventually becoming the impresario of the Sex Pistols.
Yeah, this is actually a really good point, Musican. Remember, queer Marxists interpret history through a queer lens. It doesn't mean these people were queer, they were challenged. That's actually a really good point. So we shouldn't actually be making the assumption that this person is telling the truth about what happened because they are interpreting it through a queer lens. Wow. Thank you, Bot, for finding that book for me. I appreciate it. Oh, Reagan, you found a link as well. Thank you.
Even the skinny jeans, white t-shirt, and leather jacket look that came to be identified with such punk rockers as the Ramones bore striking resemblance to the clothes worn by gay male hustlers at the time, giving this look its own queer connotation, at least for those in the know, who was anyone paying close attention, as at least one member of the Ramones, Dee Dee Ramone, spent time as a gay-for-pay hustler in the early 1970s.
I mean, what I will say is I have done some research into, like, when queer became an anti-capitalist term, and the year that queer became an anti-capitalist term was 1964, so that does actually align with all this.
He later recorded his experience in the song 53rd and 3rd, named after the famous cruising spot where he worked, and told an interviewer that the song speaks for itself. Everything I write is autobiographical and really real. Omnisexuality is also referenced in the Ramones' We're a Happy Family, which undercuts the presumed heterosexuality of the idealized nuclear family by surprising listeners with the revelation that daddy likes men. This element of queerness in punk was very much present in cinema as well, with directors like John Waters and stars like Divine. In some of Waters' most famous films like Pink Flamingos, Female Trouble, and Multiple Maniacs. I always identified with the punk community, which was gayer than it ever admitted. Pink Flamingos was a punk film, but we didn't have a name for it yet.
Give us some of your political beliefs.
Kill everyone now. Condone first-degree murder. Advocate cannibalism. Eat shit. Filth are my politics. Filth is my life.
There were also Andy Warhol films like Hustler and Women in Revolt. And of course there was the most notable cult film and musical, Rocky Horror Picture Show,
for real.
where the recently engaged couple, Brad and Janet, represent the quote-unquote pure, heteronormative ideal, and Frankenfurter and his ilk represent queerness, the sexually liberated, the quote-unquote other. The LA punk scene also has a deep queer lineage. One of the most influential figures was Vaginal Davis, a black queer intersex performer who emerged on the LA scene in the late 70s with her band The Afro Sisters, who opened for the Smiths at one point. Davis's campy, satirical stage performances took jabs at white privilege, patriarchy, and heteronormativity.
You guys understand, right? That, okay, I haven't looked into this a lot, but I've looked into it a little bit. I'm pretty sure Judith Butler was involved in these scenes. Judith Butler, of course, is one of the godparents of queer theory. Let me just chat GPT this real quick. Was Judith, I'm pretty sure I looked this up one time. Was Judith Butler involved in punk scenes in the 70s? Yes, Judith Butler, renowned philosopher and gender theorist, has mentioned being involved in punk scenes in the 70s. In interviews, Butler has reflected on the influence of punk culture on their intellectual development and outlook. The DIY ethos, rebellion against the norms, and subversion of traditional structures in punk likely resonated with and informed their later work on gender performativity and challenging societal binaries. Who else on the internet figured this shit out? Has anyone else on the internet figured this out? Judith Butler, who advanced the ideas that gender is performative, was involved in punk scenes in the fucking 70s. It was not Judith Butler who inspired the punk scene. It was the punk scene that inspired Judith Butler. Queer is a product of the punk scene. And it's not even, I was wrong about something. It's not that queer co-opted the punk scene. It's that queer is a product of the punk scene. That's so depressing, man. I love punk music. That's really upsetting to me, actually. Queer came out of the punk scene. Let me chat GPT this. Was Michel Foucault involved in the punk scene in the 70s? Nope, there's not a connection there. Actually, well, that would have been earlier, right? Was he ever involved in the punk scene? There's no evidence of that. Okay, so that's something. Foucault did engage with countercultural and radical movements, particularly with relation to sexuality and human rights. Okay, well, that's something, I guess. Yeah, where are my $2 super chats? Well, I was right and I was wrong. I thought that queer co-opted the punk scene, but I'm now becoming convinced that queer was a byproduct of the punk scene, and that makes me really upset. Yeah, bro, you may have turned out to be right, to be honest with you. You may have turned out to be right. Now, I just wanted evidence. I want receipts of that, but like if the receipts take me in that direction, I'll go in that direction. It's all about the evidence. And they did mention CBGB in the video, too. That sucks. But it makes sense, right? It makes sense. But it sucks.
Her combination of queercore punk sensibilities and studio glamour was lovingly dubbed terrorist drag by queer academic scholar Jose Esteban Munoz. She was also on the forefront of queer zine making with her self-printed and self-published zines Crude and fertile
Queer zine making, who figured that out?
LaToya Jackson. Other influential queer punks were Alice Bagg from the Bags and, of course, Darby Crash from the Germs. Alice Bagg is a queer feminist archivist, and Darby Crash was one of the seminal figures in the LA punk scene. But it wasn't just his attraction to men that made him a queer icon. It was also the mentality that he lived by. Another important part of his legacy is the intense cult-like community formed around the Germs and their audience.
Thanks, Bob.
The essay Annihilation and Innovation in the Punk Rock Commons by queer punk scholar Jose Esteban Munoz is one of the earliest written works to pave the way for modern-day queer fandom studies. Munoz writes about Crash filling the role of the sympathetic pariah and the struggle to separate the autobiographical from the mythical figure of Darby Crash.
That just, I mean, gender ideology was born out of the punk scene. Like, really think about this for a second. Really think about this. Gender ideology was born out of the punk scene. That means all the gender shit that's taught to kids in school, this is the origin of it. This is when all of these, and it's like, you know, like, I don't mind gender bending stuff. I like androgyny. I like that sort of stuff. But like, when you play it back and you acknowledge the ramifications of it, you're like, oh shit.
I am interested in the ways in which the Germs, their iconography, and their music allowed a kind of punk rock commons, a being with, in which various disaffected antisocial actants found networks of affiliation and belonging that allowed them to think and act otherwise together in a social field that was most interested in dismantling their desire for different relations within the social. Crash had a fantasy about a Germs burn, which was a unique ritual that imagined a certain futurity through the act of burning a circle onto the flesh of the Germs devotee with a cigarette. The afterlife of Crash's ritualistic scarring is the stuff of punk rock legend. Figures like Crash, Davis, and Alice Bagg paved the way for the queercore movement. Queercore is a punk movement that took place in the 80s and 90s in the midst of the AIDS crisis, trans-erasure.
Queercore. Okay, so queercore took place in the 80s and the 90s. Okay. Tracking. We need to look that up.
And Bowers versus Hardwick, when queer people in punk began to create their own spaces that catered to the needs of queer people who weren't interested in assimilating into mainstream culture.
Yo! This is queer anarcho-communist subculture. Queercore is the queer anarcho-communist subculture that we didn't have a name for. This is it. We fucking found it. We fucking found it. The queen of the damn internet. Goddamn right I'm the queen of the internet. Goddamn right. Hang on. Getting a screenshot of that. Goddamn right I am the queen of the fucking internet. Wow. I got that queercore book thing pulled up, and I think Reagan found that too. Thank you. Wow. Yo. Are you serious? The queercore community was feuding with the normal punk scene? Isn't that funny? Wow. That's actually not a bad idea. You could convert this into Carlincore and have that be the, you know, maybe that'll be the next name of my Substack after I get tired of this Better Discourses thing. Well, I'm just gonna name it Carlincore. That's actually I'm gonna screenshot that to remember that, Rationalist. That was a good idea. Oh shit. Thank you, Suzanne. I appreciate the super chat. Yeah, you didn't know how reliable it was because it was Wikipedia. I mean, Wikipedia gets things right every once in a while. Listen, I mean, I fucking love punk music. This is really This is honestly really upsetting to me. This is really upsetting to me on like a deeply personal level. I love punk music. I love punk culture. I love that whole thing. This is deeply, 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 deeply upsetting to me. I'm taking this very personally.
Of queer people who weren't interested in assimilating into mainstream culture. These bands included the likes of Limp Wrist, Pansy Division, Los Crudos, Team Dresch, The Butchies, Fifth Column, Tribe 8, and Excuse 17, Carrie Brownstein's former band before
But I mean, on the bright side, I was right. I was fucking right. I've been saying for months that I thought that this whole queer punk convergence happened in the 80s and the 90s because that's when all the zines were proliferating, and the zines that were proliferating were far left radical revolutionary socialist propaganda. So on the bright side, I was fucking right about everything. Just with a slight tweak that queer did not co-opt punk, queer was born out of punk, which is just like, it's a nuance.
Later Kinney. Like their peers in the Riot Girl movement in places like Olympia, Washington, and DC, who brought feminism to the forefront of underground rock, queercore brought explicit queerness to the forefront of punk. The terms queercore and homocore first appeared in the queer punk scene JD's in 1985. The zine was started by GB Jones from the influential Toronto queercore band Fifth Column. Bikini Kill frontwoman Kathleen Hanna has even cited the work of Fifth Column as one of Bikini Kill's most formative influences. GB Jones became friends with gay filmmaker Bruce LaBruce, and they stayed up all night writing zines and creating a homopunk paradise within its pages.
Zines.
Fifth Column was essentially the decade-older Canadian predecessors of Riot Girl bands like L7, Huggy Bear, and Bikini Kill. Bands who followed Fifth Column in the queercore movement included The Butchies, Tribe 8, and Team Dresch. One of the biggest queer punk bands was Pansy Division, who collaborated with Steve Albini and also scored an opening slot on Green Day's Dookie Arena tour. So why don't people know about this? The easy answer would be because they were likely sidelined in favor of the bands who borrowed their ideas and got popular off of them. Bowie didn't start upping the ante with his elaborate performance art and stage production until he saw Jane County perform. So you really cannot address the history without addressing the queer communities who were innovating long before the New York Dolls or Bowie. Punk and queerness go hand in hand. They both represent a communal commiseration of outcasts and social pariahs. There's also a sort of nihilism and boundary pushing related to sexuality and anti-conformist ways of thwarting respectability politics and coming together to rebel against assimilation. To quote Jose Esteban Munoz, we should resist the impulse to simply queer an object, phenomenon, or historical moment, and instead attend to it with the understanding of lines of queer genealogical connectivity as something other than tautological. Queerness is not a subtextual or alternative reading of punk. Queerness has always been there, and you really cannot address the culture of punk without acknowledging the queer creators, from musicians to DIY zine makers and writers who helmed the movement. This barely even scratches the surface of how many LGBTQIA musicians have influenced the trajectory of music history. It is not uncommon that queer people end up having to mine our own history. Punk has become commodified, watered down, and straightwashed so much, and that has been happening ever since people like Malcolm McLaren and Vivienne Westwood opened up shop. But it shouldn't be any surprise that punk, a culture and a DIY community that cater to people outside the status quo that mainstream society never served, has always been inherently queer. And this new wave of queer punk bands surfacing in the digital age is not a new thing. It is simply part of the reckoning where everyone is collectively recognizing that queerness has, as Alexander Doughty so swiftly put it, been there all along. It is here to stay, and there's nothing you can do about it.
Wow. Well, that was probably one of the most productive videos I've watched in a while. Rationalist, I like better discourses, but feel like it won't make sense to those. Well, I mean, that's exactly it. Well, it's kind of a joke right now. It's a joke. It's like, that's why I always say my Substack is Carlyn, KARLYN.substack.com. It's like the name is kind of like immaterial to it. It's my fucking Substack. It's my Substack. So maybe we'll change it to Carlin Core. Maybe we'll do that. But we're gonna play this better discourses out thing for a little while. Anyway. Maybe I'll put a header that has both better discourses and Carlin Core in it. I don't know. We'll see. That was crazy. Well, yeah. You know, guys, I think that is the perfect note to end on for today. That is like, there's no more revelations that are necessary for right now. That is the big fuck off revelation, which is, I was right. I was right. I was the only person to figure this out with you guys. You guys were all along for the ride for me. But seriously, has anyone else talked about this? Has anyone else like, I've been talking about this shit for months. Have any of these fucking conservative pundits even come anywhere close to this understanding? Queer was born out of the punk movement in the 70s. There was a feud between the queercore people and the normal punk people in the 80s and the 90s. And all the crazy ideas about fucking gender come from the punk movement and from Judaism and from fucking Judaism. It's Jewish. They're all probably, all the fucking punk people are probably Jewish. You know what? At least we know what's up, I guess. Yeah. I was the new and improved Alex Jones. Indeed. You know, we learned a lot today. It was happy hour. Cheers, everyone. This is the peanut butter and jelly beer, and it's very, very good, but it has a lot of, like, you know, peanut butter and jelly things in it. But it's very good. Cheers to everyone. Yo. I was right. But, you know, punk is awesome, man. Listen, this is not going to kill my love of punk. I love punk culture. I love punk theatrics. I love punk energy. I love punk music. I love all that stuff. We will not let this ruin punk for us. You don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. All right? You don't do that. Anyway, guys, I'm going to wrap up the stream, but if you want to check out the latest thing I've written, which is actually really interesting, head over to the Red Menace Collective. That is redmenacecollective.substack.com. You can also find it by going to redmenacecollective.com. This is a site where I am posting the drafts of my upcoming books before they become books. I kind of started accidentally a new little side project last night where I'm talking about the history of the term racism, and it's really interesting. This is the first chapter in the book. It's about 2,000 words long. This is going to be a little baby book. It's going to be maybe about 10,000 words, give or take. That's just going to track the history and the development of the word racism, and it's actually really fascinating. So you can read this draft chapter called The Invention of Racism before it's published as part of this little mini book that I'm going to be doing by heading over to redmenacecollective.substack.com, signing up for a membership of $10 a month, $100 a year. This is how I fund my writing, guys, so I do really appreciate you supporting that. And as always, the main place that you can support the work I'm doing is not on Twitter. It's by heading over to my main Substack, which is Carlyn, KARLYN.substack.com. While you're there, please make sure you check out the Counter-Revolutionary Book Club. This is a new project that I'm starting where we are reading and analyzing the most dystopian queer and gender text imaginable. You can actually subscribe to the podcast either by going to the book club link at the top and going into any of the podcast episodes. You will find the podcasts on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and I want to do a special thank you to the 3 people who've already rated it as a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts. If you're on Apple Podcasts, subscribe to the Counter-Revolutionary Book Club. give it a 5-star rating. Let people know that you're enjoying it. I would really appreciate it. We've got 3 episodes up already, kind of an introductory episode talking about it. We did Toward the Queerest Insurrection, which is one of the foundational texts of queer anarchism. We talked about polyamory and queer anarchism. And if you want the book list of things that we're reading for this podcast so you can read ahead, look at this document, the dystopian documents queer and gender activists are reading, and this provides you with the whole book list that we're kind of going through. You can see we've already done the first 2, and next we will be getting into Against the Gender Nightmare by Braden, and that's going to be a 2014 document. You can find the link to the document on the Anarchist Library. You can also find a PDF to download, and that way you can read ahead, because this is a long-ass document. It's going to take us a while to analyze this. This is a long-ass document, but we are reading the foundational texts of queer and gender ideology that apparently come out of the fucking punk movement, because I want to understand the development of this, and I think it's important. And no one that I know of has ever actually researched this. So you're welcome. I'll do it. It's fine.